All right, we are close enough to noon to go live. I've already got some questions waiting for me. So, this is the AMA session for June 2022. I will answer as many questions as I can get to. If you've got questions, you want to get them in early. You only need to ask them once because asking them multiple times doesn't get you your question answered, and I will get to as many of these as I possibly can. All right, so this is good because I ended up having to post this thing about YouTube scrubbing questions. Maybe they're not doing that anymore. Catholic Based asked a question a little while ago before the session began. What comes first, metaphysics or epistemology? And the answer is neither. You can find people who are going to say, we must begin with this basis over here in philosophy, but that's their way of understanding philosophy. So, some people think we need to begin with metaphysics as the first thing that we have to get down. Other people, epistemology, there's kind of a modern turn towards that. Some people say ethics. Some people say philosophical anthropology. There is no consensus about this. And I kind of think that there's a good reason for that, namely that we can begin from all sorts of different places. And, the key is not to figure out where to begin or what comes first. The key is to do your work in kind of a attentive, thoughtful, comprehensive way and to keep on, grinding away at it. I think that people who assume that philosophy has some sort of method or canon or basis that's a one-time fixed and for all, you want to stay away from those people if you want to actually make some real progress in the discipline. All right, second question from oldies: what do you think of Bertrand Russell and why? I think Bertrand Russell's kind of third rate, which is not bad. A third rate philosopher is better than a 10th rate philosopher. And I don't have criterion for what counts as first rate or second rate or third rate. So don't bother asking about that. It's just sort of a subjective determination. I think that, Russell is an interesting philosopher. It's kind of unfortunate that many people trained in analytic philosophy don't read the early canon of analytic philosophy anymore, because there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there with Russell and Moore and Wittgenstein and Wisdom and all these other people. Air as well is kind of interesting. And people can be interesting and have things that are well worth looking at and still be completely wrong, about stuff, just like Hobbes and Descartes and Hume are in their own ways, right? Russell is a terrible historian. Actually, he's not a terrible historian. He's a great storyteller. He's great at the narrative structure. It's unfortunate that a lot of the stuff that he says about different philosophers, you're getting Russell's take rather than a better scholarly take on them. So I wouldn't use his history of philosophy for anything. But he's worth reading. Galen says, glad to see you're feeling better from COVID. Yeah, I'm feeling better except for the fatigue. I did a video about that. It's going to force some changes probably in work load and priorities and lifestyle. You said Lev Shestov is a funny writer. Other than Kierkegaard and Plato, who are some other philosophers do you think are funny? That's a great question. Epictetus is funny as hell. You look at the ways in which he talks with other people in his discourses. He's a guy who's often speaking truth to power. You look at how he talks to this guy who's kind of high official and gets into a shouting match in the theater with the audience, who he favors one comedian, they favor another. And Epictetus is basically, if you read between the lines, he's saying, what in the hell is wrong with you, buddy? And then he gives him some useful reframing advice. So Epictetus is very funny. The cynics themselves are funny, the ones that we have bits and pieces of. Augustine, makes some jokes here and there. I think that there's a lot of little quips and witticisms in a lot of philosophers. Somebody else who's kind of around the same time and within the same spectrum, you could say, as Shestov is Miguel de Unamuno, and he can be kind of funny. at times as well. There's a lot of philosophers in the present who can be quite funny and have, good jokes here and there, including Alistair McIntyre. He's got a very, very dry sense of humor, but, Google Benedict Option McIntyre, and you'll see him talking about Rod Dreher's terrible book, The Benedict Option, and saying how Dreher and all these other, conservatives have basically, misappropriated what McIntyre had to say, and how he dissociates himself from it is quite good. All right, let's see what else we've got. Elijah, in what way might Blondel's ontology and logic be lacking, off base, or untenable? Are there major works you would put him in dialogue with to effectively address these issues? For example, Anselm of the Stoics. So I wouldn't put him in dialogue with those. I would say that I don't think that Blondel's ontology and logic are lacking. For those who don't understand the very abstruse context here, Blondel actually developed something called the metaphysics of charity and the metaphysics of insufficiency, and he also develops something that he calls a concrete logic. And I don't think that his stuff is problematic at all. I think that it's great stuff to study. I wish he'd done more of it and developed it further. And I would say that the thinkers that you want to put him into contact with would be those who, in the 20th century, really focused on the recovery of the dialectical / topical / rhetorical tradition, like Ernesto Grassi, who actually came to Blondel as sort of an emissary from Heidegger, giving him a message about how much Heidegger liked his stuff. Grassi was a recoverer of that tradition. Chaim Perlman, with his new rhetoric, is another example of that. I would say those are some of the people to bring him into contact with. There's an entire tradition there that's going back to Aristotle and Cicero and hitting on Vico along the way and stuff like that. So, all right, Robert Connor, thoughts on the current situation of the church and the synodal way? I don't know what the synodal way is supposed to mean, so I'm not going to say anything about that. Current situation of the church is in, like it always is, in as big of a mess as it has been at any given time. If you study church history, you know that things are not, there's never like the ideal age when everything was great and everybody was, in agreement and everybody was a good person. You even read the book of Acts, they had problems back then. And why did Paul write so many letters? Because people were messing up, and why do we have all these church fathers saying all these interesting things? Because people were messing up as well. I would say that, if we're talking about the Catholic Church, we can say similar things about the Protestant churches. Look at the Southern Baptist Convention and what a hot mess they have turned themselves into, right? But, I would say that a lot of the church authorities have effectively lost the confidence of the people, in part through covering up scandals and focusing more on, keeping things nice and orderly and not on being pastors of Christ, and this is a perennial problem. There's always reforms needed, not as if they aren't equally a mess in the Eastern churches or in the Protestant churches or new religious movements as well. And not as if it's not a problem in other religions as well, and in anti-religious or non-religious movements too. So, all right. Dino says, I know this must be a weird question, but are there any works on philosophy of prayer, what prayer is? Yeah, there's lots of things. I think you can Google that. It's something that gets discussed quite a lot in the philosophy of religion. And there's authors that you could go to. James's Varieties of Religious Experience or Kierkegaard's texts. St. Anselm himself effectively carried out a revolution in prayer in the 11th century. If you just get his book, Prayers and Meditations, translated by Benedict Ward. I think there may be a new translation out there of those. There's a nice foreword in there by her, great Benedictine thinker herself, and these amazing rhetorically constructed prayers that lead you into a sort of contact with, God and the saints. So there's lots and lots of material out there that you could study. I'm sure there's a ton of stuff in the like low church Protestant evangelical, um, you know, philosophical traditions, but I don't really know it. I can tell you this. One place where you could go is looking at the Wesleyan tradition. They are very interested in what goes on in prayer. So there's lots of places you could go with that. Sansei, love your work. The camera is looking great. This is just my camera from my Big Mac. This is actually quite an old computer. I think we bought this maybe in 2013 or so. So it's coming up to its 10-year anniversary. I'm thankful that it's still working well, because computers don't always last that long. Erickson, thoughts on the philosophy of logic and your position in this topic? I don't have a position in this topic. Philosophy of logic. What we're talking about there would be sort of, instead of just logic as a discipline, a meta look at what logic is. I mentioned that Maurice Blondel has writings on this. So does, for that matter, so does Heidegger. Heidegger actually has a lot of interesting things to say about logic. Hegel, of course, has two different, the science of logic and the encyclopedia logic. Then there's Benedetto Croce, and there's all sorts of people out there. John Stuart Mill has some really interesting things to say about it. But, you got to kind of dig around in the literature. I don't know what the current up-to-date, philosophy of logic stuff would be in the present, because that's not really an area for me. All right, JB, nice to see you here. Glad to hear you're feeling better. Please be careful and take it easy. People can get messed up jumping back into it after recovery. Yeah, so that is actually good advice. Those of you who don't know the context of this, I wound up with COVID in late April. And, I didn't have to get hospitalized, thank God. And I had the Omicron variant that doesn't go after your lungs, and it didn't go after my brain, thank God, because I got to make a living with it. But it did, put me down for quite a while. It was rough. COVID, we're learning, not only does its own little dance routine on you, it's also like a guy who walks around and turns up switches here and there. So the chronic pain that I have in joints and stuff like that, turn that knob up to 7, sometimes up to 10. I've had Lyme's disease twice, and I've had mononucleosis in the past, and we know that there's COVID kind of affects those as well. So it was rough going, and I had to finish up the semester. Obviously I couldn't film, so I did other stuff. And then you get behind on work, and you're like, I got to get caught up, and I'd like to get back to the gym. And on the one hand, you got to take it easy and make sure you're getting enough rest. On the other hand, I still have fatigue just about every single day that hits, and when it hits, it's like a curtain coming down. I can do some things like when we saw Primus at a concert just a couple days ago, I could sit there and watch them, and clap and stuff like that, and even get up and dance a bit. But if you'd asked me to talk about philosophy or something at the concert, that wasn't going to be happening. And so, I'm learning. I'm the kind of person who's been hard driving for decades, and I'm learning I gotta take it easy, like JB is saying here. So. All right, Bill Bob Baggins, what are your thoughts on immortality, specifically immortality through staying alive, considering humanity is living longer? Well, we're living longer in some places. I mean, there's other places where life expectancy is slowly going down. Think about Russia, particularly for men. I mean, now one main source of that is hardcore alcoholism. So if you cut that out of your life, maybe you'll live longer. But it's not as if life expectancy is just a guaranteed that it's just going to keep getting longer and longer. I mean, we might get up to like 120 or 140 through medical advances and stuff like that, provided we don't burn up the planet or wind up in horrible wars caused by global displacements because of climate change. So a lot of this is very contingent, right? Um, but even if you live to 120, you're still going to die. That's not immortality. That's just extended life. If we want to talk about immortality and we want to not think about it in a religious sort of way, assuming that there's something like a soul that survives, then we got to think about other physical ways in which us, who we are, would somehow be preserved. And a lot of that's just sci-fi. There's a lot of cool proposals out there. There's a lot of optimism about uploading yourself to the cloud or things like that, but that's just sci-fi. It's not like it's going to happen right away. And there's all sorts of interesting metaphysical and epistemological and anthropological problems that we have to solve. Like, well, is that actually me? That thing that you claim is my brain scans, and my personality uploaded in a computer, or there's a lot of moving parts to this. So I don't. Maybe you're asking me about sort of like moral questions when it comes to it. I don't have a problem with people wanting to be immortal, but I think a lot of people want to be immortal in irresponsible ways, right? They're like, I want to be immortal and I want to be like in a video game where everybody else is an NPC and I can do whatever the hell I want with them. That would be a problem, right? Or I want to be immortal, but I don't care how much energy has to be consumed to keep me immortal, depriving other people of those resources, right? I think that's problematic too. Jeremy, thoughts on theories of truth and what is your position if you have one? I'm a pluralist. I think that we have a lot of different perspectives on truth. I won't call all of them theories. And actually, I'm going to be having a book review video coming out very soon on Simon Blackburn's On Truth, which I, qualifiedly endorse. I think it's got a book with a lot of problems to it. We have a lot of different theories of truth that we talk about in intro to philosophy classes, like correspondence, coherence, pragmatic, deflationist, but those don't adequately capture what classic philosophers have actually had to say about the nature of truth. Aquinas is not simply a correspondence theorist. Hegel definitely isn't just a coherence theorist, right? Anselm has an entire book called On Truth, in which he talks about not only truth in thought and expression, but also in the nature of things, in the will, in action, how actions themselves can signify. And very little of the contemporary discourses about truth take that sort of thing into account. And I think it's important to have a sort of wide net. I think that we have to have a toolbox that's got a lot of different perspectives and theories in it. There's some cases where maybe we need something like adequatio between language and things, or thought and things. Maybe there's other cases where we really do need to think about practical truth, as Aristotle discusses it in the Nicomachean Ethics, book 6, which would be similar to what Anselm is talking about in On Truth, chapters 3, 4, some of the later chapters as well, definitely 12, right? So I think that, long story short, might be a bit of an unsatisfying answer. We really do need multiple theories or perspectives on truth. Made of Clay, how is ontology related to modern psychotherapy? I'll just answer this right off the bat. Depends on which ontology, which modern psychotherapy. It's not as if there's a thing out there called ontology or a thing out there called psychotherapy. There's different kinds of psychotherapy. There's different approaches. The same, modality may be used by two different people in different ways. Ontology, that it depends on what you mean by that too, right? There's different meanings to these terms. There is no simple relation between them like that. Now you say it seems like ontology is dismissed and therapists only seem to care about the tried and true method without going deeper. Totally depends on the therapist. I mean, I work with psychotherapists who are very interested not only in ontology but also in ethics and epistemology and other things as well, but they're not the usual psychotherapists. These are people who sought me out and said, I need to bring in a philosopher to help me, shore up what I'm doing. I mean, part of it could also be a language choice. If you go in and you're like, hey, I want to talk about ontology with you, and the therapist is like, what in the hell is that? Or they got some weird, whacked out version of it back when they were an undergraduate. Maybe they're like, well, I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about your treatment plan instead. But if you can relate to them and say, well, listen, a treatment plan is making some ontological assumptions, or maybe don't call it ontology, maybe call it metaphysics, or maybe you don't even need to use those words. Then you can perhaps open up a dialogue with them. It really depends on your terminology choice. Ridicule. Any advice or reading recommendations for struggling with a longing for past loves, or just fighting to try to tame my desires in general as a young person? So two totally different topics. Yeah, I mean, I would say good literature is kind of helpful with that. It's not going to give you like a blueprint, but you get to read about other people's struggles and maybe, say, holy shit, somebody back 100 years ago was feeling the same way that I was. So that can be quite helpful, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that far back. Good literature from the present can be doing that too. I mean, just think about if you haven't read Octavia Butler's Parables, Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents. Her main character, a main character in it, loses her great love in the middle of kind of a catastrophe, and also loses their child too, in kind of an interesting way. And you could read that and be like, well, not all of this applies to me, but some of this is kind of similar. I mean, I get a lot out of reading Rainer Maria Rilke's poems and letters and stuff like that. I actually ordered a facing German English version of the Dunio elegies because I want to reread them and have the German at my disposal and think about my lost sassy cat, who isn't, that's not a romantic relationship, but it's probably one of the closest relationships I have had in my lifetime. Certainly the closest relationship with an animal, a non-human animal that I've had. And I want to think about her, existing past death, and the difference between death and life and all that sort of stuff. That can be helpful as well. Now, the question about taming your desires in general as a young person. So, you're going to see some philosophers basically write young people off, like Aristotle, for example. He's, if you've ever read the Nicomachean Ethics, at the very beginning of the work, he says something that my students, get riled up about every time. You can't teach young people ethics, until maybe they're 30 years old. Why not? Because they're too driven by their passions and desires. And this is a silly statement by Aristotle. The one thing that is not silly about it is his pointing out that some people are immature in years and other people are immature in their development. So there's some 50-year-olds who don't have their proverbial shit together, and you can't effectively teach them ethics either. I think it's actually good as young people to develop that domain that Goleman called emotional intelligence, being able to recognize when you're feeling a particular emotion. And this extends not just to the emotions proper, but to moods, to desires and aversions, drives, and things like that. And I think there's a lot of philosophical literature and psychotherapeutic literature that can help with that. And being able to recognize what's going on with other people, and then developing some regulation. And it doesn't have to be 100%, but, learning how to, if you're like getting angry about something, or you're getting like really attracted to somebody and you're like, ooh, but there's some red flags with them, learning how to be able to like, not necessarily like just cut your emotions off, but to guide them, right? That can be quite helpful too. And, that would fit in with the taming desires part, right? So there's an entire literature out there of understanding the emotions going back to ancient times that I think is quite useful. And I would suggest sort of eclectically drawing on it and studying different frameworks, and then seeing what's valuable in them. Um, Raphael says, just want to say, love your videos. I'm from Brazil, study philosophy by myself. I read the books, then come here to see your lectures so I can better understand them. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that, or to read that, because that's one of the things that I came to realize when I first started posting my class videos over a decade ago. There were comments from people they were saying a couple things. One was, I'm a student. My professor won't actually explain anything. Thank you for posting this, because now I actually understand what Plato's saying, or Cicero, or whoever, right? And then there were a lot of people who were like, I can't go to university. I don't have the money, or I don't live in a place that has it, or my country is kind of in a mess, or I'm working too much. I've got responsibilities. So being able to listen in on your classes, and read the text when I can get access to them is very helpful for me. Lots of people were saying that. And so I came to realize that was this vast number of what we call lifelong learners out there, and that whatever I created could be useful for them. Not that I have like the final word on a lot of stuff. I mean, there's for any given thinker that I work on, there's probably many people who are better scholars on that person than I am. But I'm the one who put it out there, sort of like the half-hour Hegel series. Wouldn't you rather have somebody who's like a Hegel scholar doing that? Straight. That's all they do. Yeah, probably. But they're not willing to get up there and get in front of the chalkboard and do it, and I am. So I'm glad that the stuff is helpful for you. That's really good. Oh, here's a good one about Hegel. Ahmad, what's your take on Hippolyte's Genesis and Structure of the Phenomenology of Spirit? Classic secondary text. Hippolyte, if you don't know, Jean Hippolyte was also the French translator of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, and he managed to take a single volume work, and his translation is 2 volumes. And he goes, well, how the hell did that happen? It's got all these lovely footnotes throughout the entire thing. So it's sort of like him translating and in a dialogue with Hegel and the reader, which I just love. I think that's amazing. I don't actually have a copy of that. I have photocopies, because my mentor, when I was in graduate school, had that on the shelf, and then he had his own annotations in the side. And I was like, would you mind if I photocopied these? And he's like, yeah, fine, go ahead. That's the way he talked. And so I went and photocopied every friggin' page of that, and I've got it stored away somewhere. So I actually should buy some copies. And I think that Hippolyte's, his translation has been superseded in French, just as like Bailey's has and Miller's has recently. But I think it's good, and I think his commentary is quite useful. Does he cover everything in as great a depth as I might like? No, there's places where he doesn't say as much as I would prefer. But what are you going to do? I mean, when you write your own stuff, you come to realize how much work it is. All right, so here's one from Roughly Bumble. Good to see you here too as well. Any thoughts on Gilgamesh, or on how certain major Old Testament events also take place in its narrative? Yeah, I mean, I think Gilgamesh is a great work of literature that everybody should read. There's a lot of this Mesopotamian stuff that's really cool, like the Enuma Elish. Everyone should read that too, or the Enki stories. It's all really wonderful things. And when I teach world religions, I don't have them read Gilgamesh. Although, I could actually, that might be a good idea. But I do have them read the Enuma Elish, and we talk about the model of the conflict between the gods. Gilgamesh is also, broaching, as is some other ancient literature, some really, really important themes. Why do we have to die? What's the underworld like? What is the purpose of living? What kind of good is friendship? So it's really worth checking out. And it's got this cool hero, Gilgamesh, right? And then his buddy Enkidu, the hairy guy. And are there connections with Old Testament narratives? I mean, we can call them events if we want. We don't know if they actually really happened or not. I mean, literature reflects literature. These things don't develop in a complete vacuum. And what we nowadays think of as Judaism developed over millennia within a complex Middle Eastern context. So it would be surprising if there weren't any interconnections. I mean, another religion that also exerted massive influence on Judaism and then Christianity and even on Islam is Zoroastrianism. And the reasons for that are kind of complex and geopolitical, right? So that's quite interesting. All right, let's see what else we got. Leslie says a top psych hospital's president admitted he had sex with multiple patients. Oh, that's horrible. Studies show around 10% of psychoanalysts have sex with patients. My psychoanalyst affirmed having sex with patients. Should I report a psychoanalyst who affirmed this? If I knew my report would be believed, and should I stop seeing the therapist? Yes to both. I mean, those are major red flags. It's an abuse of power in a uneven power dynamic, and it also violates the code of ethics that there's various codes of ethics out there. I know the one for the American Psychological Association pretty well, and it says you can't do that. I mean, you can't even have business relationships outside of things with clients. Clients are supposed to be clients, and that's it. You're not supposed to, as we say, have dual roles, right? And if you do, you better have somebody else supervising that. And I don't think when it comes to sex with patients that you're going to get one of your peers signing off on it and saying, yeah, go for it. That sounds great. Same thing goes, by the way, for university professors. People always have but what if you fall in love with them? Too bad. Find somebody else. The people who prey on those who are in one down power positions, there's always something skeevy going on. And this is very important too for a psychiatrist or psychologist or counselor. They're supposed to have some good judgment. And so the fact that they would screw a patient or a client or whatever means that they shouldn't be in the therapeutic situation at all, probably. So I'd report them. You're doing a good thing if you do report them. And if it turns out to be false, well, they can sort that out in the committee stuff, All right. NL Other Voices. If you had to pick one, Thousand Plateaus, Anti-Oedipus, Kafka, or What is Philosophy? I've heard you're more averse of Deleuze plus Guattari over Deleuze solo. Have you spent much time with any of those books? Yeah, I mean, I started reading Deleuze and Guattari over 2.5 decades ago. Anti-Oedipus was the first book that I read back in, it would have been 1993. And I'm not averse. That's the wrong word. I just think that Deleuze doesn't do as good work with Guattari as he does on his own. I think Deleuze is better. I mean, if you had to ask me what are my favorites, Essays Critical and Clinical and Logic of Sense. That's it. I mean, I like his history books or history of philosophy books, his book on Nietzsche. That's quite good. A lot of what he's doing in Logic of Sense is history of philosophy as well. And the Leibniz book, The Fold, I really enjoy that. But and it's not as if I'm like, oh, Anti-Oedipus, stay away. No, it's just I don't think that it's as thoughtful and rigorous as his other stuff. I think that he really, really enjoyed what Guattari brought to the table, but that doesn't mean that I think that it's good stuff. So, All right. Abrudan, hello, thoughts on Locke's theory of ownership and the Stoic oikeiosis proprioception. Two totally different things. The Stoics don't say you own yourself. With Locke, it's got an interesting way of being used in his time. It's definitely been misappropriated by libertarians all the way up to the present. And you notice that people like Nozick have to propose alternate ways of making sense out of mixing your labor and property to make sense of things. I think it's sort of a non-starter. When I hear somebody talking about it, I just kind of zone out because I'm like, yeah, this person isn't really worth paying that much attention to. Just like when, nowadays people are like, well, the woke this and the woke that. I'm like, well, that's definitely somebody who's not worth paying attention to, other than how they could mess things up. So I'm not a fan of Locke's theory of self-ownership. The Stoic theory of oikeiosis, not so much connected with proprioception. It's rather connected with self-affection and self-perception, right? Proprioception is like, moving around and stuff like that, right? We get this mainly coming from Heracles and a little bit from Cicero, and then from some other discussions. I think people make too much of it. It's not supposed to be, like a doctrine in and of itself. It's supposed to connect up with other Stoic doctrines. So, yeah. All right, Cinder, how do you get over the feeling that you're not doing things on time? I'm 21. I always have this nagging feeling I'm behind. Oh, that's a good question. So, it depends on what the thing is. Like, if I say that I'm going to get something done at a certain date and then it happens later, then I'm behind. And I'm actually looking at a book that came out much later than expected. This is, Stoicism Today, selected essays, volume 3 that Leah Goldrick and I edited. And I got a lot of stuff and so a lot of projects going on, and I was mostly the drag on this. This came out last December, and it probably should have come out like a year before that, right? So I was behind on that, and that's objectively so because I made that commitment. If it comes to things like, oh, all of my friends are, this happens a lot in people's 20s. All my friends are finding relationships and getting married and buying a house and having kids. What's going on with me? Well, who says that they're doing the right thing? I mean, a lot of the decisions we make in our 20s about our romantic partners and jobs and stuff like that turn out to be, poorly informed and have, divorce rate's about 50%, right? So, and breakups are probably even more for relationships. So, a lot of times we're not really behind. We're just kind of, we're not doing exactly what everybody else does. When it comes to like projects, writing things, some people don't start their writing career until their 60s, and then they start putting out good stuff. Other people start early. It all depends along the way. I mean, there's some things where like, if you're going to do certain physical things, you probably do need to want to get them in early on. Like, it's too late for me to be a runner because I've already torn 2 ligaments in one of my knees, and that's just not in the cards for me. But that's probably not the case for you, right? You're probably thinking about other kinds of things, and you're not really behind. Are there any philosophers who talk about like feeling like you're behind? Nobody comes to mind offhand, but you could think about like theories of human development and poke around in them, and also look at some of these philosophers and take a look at the works that they put out when they got older and accumulated some wisdom. So, all right. Abdeli Jabbar, do you believe in God? Yep. Online person, any suggestions for texts that look at role metaphor plays in thinking and interpreting, at the role metaphor plays in thinking and interpreting experience? Yeah, I mean, this is there's like tons and tons of stuff out there. This is kind of a commonplace in the entire philosophy of language and semiotics tradition. I mean, I think that somebody who's really good for getting into that stuff is Umberto Eco, because he's also great at being a gateway into looking at other people as well. I would be careful when people say that, like, this is the metaphor and this is how metaphors work. Metaphors are pretty complicated. There's a lot of different kinds of metaphors. So I'd be careful about people who are making too sweeping claims. Another person who comes to mind too, Paul Ricoeur. He's actually got a book called The Rule of Metaphor that would be good to check out. So, Ricky says, what are your thoughts on Alan Bloom? Thanks for your lectures on the Apology and Credo. Helped get through political philosophy. Glad the lectures were helpful. I'm not a fan of Alan Bloom. I think he was kind of an old, sourpuss in many respects. His closing of the American Mind was pretty cringy, even when it first came out, because I remember when it came out, and there were parts of it where you were like, wow, this guy's pretty out of touch, That's basically it, I mean, he's known for being a commentator on Plato, and there's lots of commentators on Plato. I don't know that he's particularly important. So I'll put it to you this way: he's not anybody I ever think about unless people ask me about him. Zeno says, I have officially finished Being in Time. That's wonderful. Now you can restart reading it because you're never finished with great philosophical works. You have made it to the end, and now, you've gotten through your first reading of it. Now you can decide what parts you want to go back to, what things you think are really important and what's going to stick with you. Alfonso, what are my thoughts on quantum physics? Quantum physics exists. There's a lot of people who use quantum as an adjective to try to make things seem sexier. Usually no real connection with quantum physics. I'm not really sure what you're asking me about. Abdel Jabbar, why is Martin Heidegger so hard to understand? He's a difficult thinker. Most difficult thinkers are hard to understand. Just keep at it, keep working at it, and eventually you will understand them, All right. JB has a funny observation here. Definitely not uploading myself to the cloud while Amazon and Google are running it. So this is actually, there's the short term. Yes, you're completely right about that. Or Microsoft, or Apple, or who am I leaving out? Apple, Amazon, Google, Microsoft. Who's the other? The big five. Could have been Yahoo, but Yahoo, crapped the bed when they had the opportunity. Facebook Meta, right? They're trying to break into that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, who the hell would think, oh yeah, I'm sure that they're going to be good to me once I make myself totally vulnerable to these massive corporations, because they give a crap about me so much now. I'm sure they're going to treat me even better when they're responsible for me in perpetuity, right? No, of course not. And you could say, well, I'll work with a private company, How do you know 20 years from now they're not going to get bought out by some other company that does something different? The notion of duty, pretty shaky among corporations these days, isn't it? Except when they're pretty small and close to the ground, close to their consumer base. So I don't, I wouldn't, I'd be very leery about that, right? Toothless Tiger Shark. Does the Loeb Classical Library carry Arius Didymus? I couldn't find it. If you couldn't find it, then they don't carry it. So it's pretty easy to see their entire library. No, there's actually a different translation of Arius Didymus that has the Greek on one side and the English on the other side. Just Google it; it'll come up on Amazon. I forget exactly who the publisher is. It's got. I will say this too. sometimes you look at the translator's choices in that translation and you're like, this is a little weird. Why did you translate this Greek term this way? It's almost as if they needed to like make it their own. And that's always unfortunate. But for the most part, it's not going to lead you astray. So, Alex, do you have any familiarity with Islamic philosophy? Avicenna, Al-Farabi, Averroes? Yeah, I have familiarity, but I don't have enough to consider myself enough of an expert to do videos on it. The next question that people, why don't you do Islamic philosophy? Well, because hell, I don't have to do everything. There's plenty of other people out there who could be shooting videos on that, and they're better suited to it. Marquette University just down the road has the Aquinas and the Arabs project, and graduate students are actually studying Arabic so they can read these texts. And not all of us have to do everything. I like to observe my limitations. So, all right, Tractatus, is it worth it to read complete works of some philosophers, or should we just better read the key works of more philosophers? Totally depends. There isn't a one size, you should do this sort of thing. I mean, if you want to, so let's take Heidegger as an example, right? We're fortunate in that not only do we have a lot of, his main works translated, like Being and Time, for example, but we also have all these lectures now that have been translated in recent decades. And, if you want to understand Heidegger, do you need to read everything? No. I mean, I understand Heidegger and I haven't read every single thing. When I find something that I'm really interested in, like, his lectures on Aristotle or his lectures on the phenomenology of religious life, I buy it and I'm like, holy shit, let's check this out, But it's not as if I didn't understand Heidegger before that, right? And it depends on what you want to do with your studies. I mean, there's some philosophers who you could read your way through fairly easily. Like, think about Rene Descartes. The Atom and Tannery, I think, is 3 or 4 volumes. And it includes all of his major works and his letters and stuff like that. But, do you need to read all of that? If you have a fascination with Descartes, maybe, or you want to be a Descartes scholar. Harry Frankfurt, actually, in one of his books, admitted that the reason why he chose to become a Descartes scholar was because the canon of works was so small, he thought it was more manageable than, like, reading Aristotle or Hegel or somebody like that. So it's totally up to you what you want to do with that. R.T. Whitby, Thomas Aquinas said that to be created in the image of God is to have intelligence, rationality, actually. So if we find intelligent aliens, does that mean that they would also be created in the image of God? Insofar as you think that that's what the image of God is, then the answer would be yes, right? What are the other ways in which the image of God is understood? Rene Descartes says that we are made in the image of God in the sense that we have an infinite will. Maybe aliens have that. The great Christian, early patristic author Clement of Alexandria said that we are created in the image of God and that we are musical. Isn't that an interesting idea? This is in the Stromata, by the way. So we would see whether there's something like the equivalent of music. Think Close Encounters of the Third Kind, right? It's not as if there's a single take about what it is to be created in the image and likeness of God, right? The icon, or what is the in the Book of Wisdom? There's a different word that's used in the Greek. Anyway, it doesn't really matter in the Septuagint. This is an interesting thing, though, and even if you're a secular person, somebody who I did work on recently, and I'm actually going to be putting out a Medium piece about, is Olaf Stapleton. And when he's talking about aliens, do you know what he calls them when they've reached a certain level of development? Other men, other human beings. And he talks about the terrestrial human beings, that's us. And then he talks about the other human beings throughout the galaxy, some of whom they're not even connected to us by like arising in the same way that we do. Some of them are plant men. Some of them are other derived things, So, yeah, if an alien life reaches a sort of a certain level of whatever we want to call being human, then, they're human. Um, I guess we would say. So, all right. Extinctionist Records, black metal. Why aren't you a vegan? Because I don't want to be vegan, and most vegans that I've met are kind of assholes. I'm not convinced that I absolutely have to be vegan. It's interesting that people always like frame it in that way, right? Like the burden of proof is on you. I mean, I think we can say let's eliminate a lot of animal cruelty and if you're going to have meat, have it ethically farmed and slaughtered. We're mostly pescatarian now, and we buy our fish from Sitka salmon and places like that where it's sustainable practices and it's fair labor practices and stuff like that. So, I'm not that concerned about becoming a vegan. I think that we should focus on sort of incremental change rather than this like you're on this side or this side kind of stuff. Brian Collins, I've been trying to get into Dostoevsky. At this point, he might not be for me. Is there a barrier to getting into Dostoevsky? Most people don't bring up. I like Kafka and Henry James a lot. Yeah, I mean, I kind of think that a lot of people go wrong by saying, I'm going to read Dostoevsky. What do I need to read? Oh, Crime and Punishment or Brothers Karamazov. Brothers Karamazov is a slog. It's not my favorite novel by far. I only teach parts of it. I mean, I wouldn't. Who's got the time to teach the whole friggin' thing, right? If I was going to teach it in a class. His novels vary considerably from novel to novel. I will say one thing that is kind of off-putting about Dostoevsky, and it's Russian literature in general. You almost need like a card to keep track of who the hell is who, But this is a problem not just for Dostoevsky, but also for Gogol and Turgenev and Pushkin and all these other people. My favorite Dostoevsky works are The Possessed and Notes from Underground. And I'm not that big on part 2 of Notes from Underground, quite frankly. I'm mostly interested in the first part. So I don't get into Henry James myself. I found him kind of tough for me, but I think other people really like him. All right, Evan, hope you're well. Just want to thank you for the great videos and content. Self-directed studies of Hegel and Descartes have helped me through some tough periods and books alike. Well, that's very good. I'm glad that the videos could be helpful for you. I think a lot of times it's what you do with them rather than the videos themselves. Your average French Canadian immigrant. I've been reading a lot of cog-sci and game theory, and it's concerning how much we're influenced and determined and how much we're bodily. How can we possibly have soul free will? I mean, maybe the cog-sci and game theory is making sweeping assumptions as part of their methodology that you shouldn't automatically buy into and believe. There's just a suggestion, I mean, do you have a choice about whether you have a viewpoint on free will or not? You got free will. I mean, do we have free will in the sense like we can choose anything we want? No. And that's usually what they're attacking, right? But why would you believe the cog-sci people? Half of what they say is like these tiny little brain studies done on a few people, and they draw these big sweeping conclusions. It's just like psychology people in general, and games theory. Holy shit, is that full of assumptions? You got to read like the classic literature on this stuff. Like Games and Decisions by Lucia Raffia. And you're like, this is all mathematics with a little bit of economics thrown in. And wow, are these subjects who have no, background, or they're like pure imaginary subjects. So, I mean, if you remind yourself of that, you might develop a kind of critical distance towards those things. Messac, who are the best authors who talk about how God influences the world through divine providence, problem of evil, mind-body problem? I mean, I don't know. that you're asking an awful lot right there. So if you only asked one of those, maybe I could say who I think the best authors are. But, how God influences the world, the problem of evil, and the mind-body problem, I don't know. Logie K, what do you think about meta-ethics and what's your position on it? I think meta-ethics is bullshit. And because it's turned itself into a field that's like, we're doing meta-ethics, not substantive ethics, or pick whatever else you want to call it. Every single tradition in normative ethics, take utilitarianism, for example, has meta-ethical discussions. Actually read the Bentham, read the Mill, not just ethics textbooks or articles, but read the actual literature. Immanuel Kant, right, is, by when he's talking about the heteronomy of the will, that's what we call meta-ethics. So the distinction between normative ethics and meta-ethics is kind of bullshit and arbitrary, and I think kind of self-serving for the people who claim that they're doing meta-ethics. Every substantive ethics contains a meta-ethics. Every meta-ethical position winds up turning into a substantive ethics. So you can use the term if you want, but I think it's kind of slippery. It's sort of like language and meta-language. You've always got meta-language, right? It's more of a pragmatic distinction than a real distinction, and certainly should not be a disciplinary distinction. Thera Decay, do you think an anarchist society with no power dynamics is feasible? I don't even think it's conceivable, frankly, once you start thinking things through, let alone feasible. Feasibility would require we have to have a way of getting from here to there, and I don't see how that's going to happen. Alexander Graybar, any idea where I can find writings on or of Heraclitus? Google it. I mean, yeah, you can find Heraclitus's fragments right online. You can even find it in the ancient Greek. Just Google it, and it's super easy to get. There's plenty of other books you could buy too. Usually they'll be like fragments of the pre-Socratics, or philosophy before Socrates, or something like that, and they'll all have the same basic stuff, right? So super easy to. We don't have Heraclitus's original writings. We just have fragments, and everybody's got the same stuff. Wise Sophistry, I just graduated. I wanted to say I appreciated all your content during my time in school. You distilled topics into a form that made it so much easier to understand. Thank you. I'm glad. And I hope that you continue finding this stuff useful, because I hope you continue studying this stuff. Maybe you take a little break, it's fine to do that. I actually took a break between undergraduate and grad school, where I was, less studying philosophy, more reading literature and working on languages and exercising and working 2 jobs and, saving up money and stuff like that. But, hopefully you want to keep on, keep on studying the stuff. So, all right. Zeno, advice for reading Capitalism and Schizophrenia. I have it on my shelf, never touched. I mean, I don't have any straightforward advice. Get it down, start reading it, maybe make yourself a nice cup of coffee or tea or whatever you like, or have some snacks and whatever it takes to get you to do it, right? Or maybe you could join a reading group where there's accountability and you have to do it. Those would be my suggestions. Christian Fernandez, good books for beginners in philosophy, good place to start studying philosophy of architecture. I wouldn't have a clue. I'm not an architect, it's not an area of my work. Good books for beginners in philosophy. If you Google, Sadler, 10 books philosophy, I've got an article on that, in Medium. That's probably my most read thing. They're not the only works that you can start with, but I give reasons why each of them would be a good thing to start with. Kayla, can you break down Midgley's first argument is as follows: if moral isolationism is correct, then one can respect a culture without judging it. I don't know. I'd have to get Midgley's piece about moral isolationism out there and read it. I don't have it in the top of my head, so I don't know. All right. Jolene says, have you engaged with the work of Charles Sanders Peirce? Yeah, I think for the first time, probably 25 years ago, maybe less or maybe more. Would you recommend any specific text to get into him, primary or secondary? Well, always primary. I mean, if you want to read a thinker, read the thinker. Don't read something about him. Seeing as he only wrote papers, he is hard to get into. Well, I mean, I don't see why only writing papers would make somebody hard to get into as opposed to writing books. Peirce is kind of tricky in that he's got his own vocabulary. So, I would get like the selected writings book that is readily available. You can find it in a lot of libraries and bookstores, and just start working your way through it. And realize that he's got kind of a convoluted writing style. And, he's no William James, so to speak, right? But thank God he's also not a John Dewey. If you want to talk about overly complicated prose, John Dewey is really somebody who did that. You just got to keep plowing at him, and you'll get it. Nick, if you could have one philosophy get the Hollywood biopic treatment, so one philosophical movement, I think you mean, who would you choose and who would you like to direct? I like the idea of Darren Aronofsky directing the trial of Socrates. I mean, I don't know. I don't pay attention to directors all that much. I'm not a film person. So you're talking about like a particular instance, right? There are actually, I think, things out there with the trial of Socrates on YouTube. So a philosophical event, you mean? I don't know. I'd have to think about that. It's not something I often give a lot of thought to, what we should turn into film or movie stuff. I think in part because most of the people who do film or movie stuff that's connected with philosophy, just like they do with mathematics, they do such a terrible job with it. Even shows like the Good Place, I think, do a mediocre job with things. It's hard to make this kind of stuff like into Hollywood compelling. It's not hard to make good philosophically deep film, but you got to introduce, the willingness to not explain everything and to not like constantly guide your viewers along, in order to do that. And I think Europeans tend to be better at that than Americans. So, all right. Therica, can communism work? Depends on what you mean by communism. Depends on what you mean by work, Alfonso goes back to the quantum thing. Thank you for answering that. I was referring to quantum teleportation. I don't know anything about that. I don't know enough about that to have an opinion. So, all right, Ibn, where would you suggest is the best place to starting to read philosophy? Well, I gave a response to that a little bit earlier about the 10 books you could start with. But as you say, you find Nietzsche interesting, start with Nietzsche. First philosophy book I ever read was Camus' Myth of Sisyphus. I understood maybe a tenth of it at the time when I was 14 or 15. I did read Nietzsche, when I was a teenager, and didn't understand most of what I was reading there either, but didn't break my brain by doing that. Abdulabar asks me to do something I've already done. Can you make videos on Michel Foucault? You got to Google. Jesus. People ask me about stuff as if we don't have a search function in YouTube itself. I mean, you just go to my channel and type in the stuff you're looking for. And if it's there, it'll pop up. And if it's not there, it's because I haven't done stuff on it, Is there Jack Heaton, is there anything to the fourth political theory a la Dugan and Millerman? I don't know, because I haven't read Dugan. So I suspect it's probably kind of warmed over traditionalist bullshit from the previous century or two centuries, but I don't really know, so I'd have to read it. Let's see here. Aiden, I get the impression you're Catholic. Have you looked into Eastern Orthodoxy? Buddy, I used to teach religious studies classes, and I've been engaged in ecumenical dialogue for decades and decades. So yeah, I know a bit about Eastern Orthodoxy. What do you think about the emphasis on mystical theology as opposed to a more scholastic based one? I think that anybody who articulates things in that way doesn't know anything about theology. There's lots of mystical theology in the Catholic tradition. There's lots of scholasticism. If you go back far enough in the Orthodox, these sorts of like this versus this, big picture stuff, those are non-starters. Greg, if you don't want to be an employee and work for someone else, is there a contradiction in becoming yourself an employer? Why would there be a contradiction? I don't see that. That's a, you know, uh, you're always going to work for somebody else depending on how you define employee. Employee is a relative term, by the way, employee to employer or client, to patron or whatever. Sansa, here's a good question. Did your philosophical pursuit ever have you have less or more faith in God? Depends on what you mean by faith. For me, faith is something that is not like just a bunch of propositions that you assent to or something like that. Faith is something you live, right? It's dynamic. Faith without works is dead. And so, people like to talk a lot about faith, but I think we got to be really careful in that. And yeah, I mean, I came into graduate school having left the church a long time before, and I came back to it and got confirmed by a guy now who's a cardinal, believe it or not. He was a bishop at the time. And I did so because of reading and studying people like Anselm of Canterbury. And it wasn't just like the ontological argument. No, it was his works and seeing his life and then engaging with people who practiced what they preached. Nobody ever converts because of just one thing. William James is totally right about this in varieties of religious experience, I think. All right, let's see. We'll take some other people's things here. So Trolato de Taco has a retort to I'm not sure what. Maybe you're just bad at math. Yeah, I could be bad at math. I mean, I did major in it as an undergraduate. I did do work in the foundations of mathematics, but yeah, you're probably right. I'm just bad at math. All right. Ilahi, any recommended read after finishing Shestov? All Things Are Possible. Yeah. So there's All Things Are Possible are often bundled together with penultimate words, and that's definitely worth reading. He's also got some early works that are really, really good, talking about Dostoevsky and Nietzsche. All of these are available too online. You can find these for free. Athens and Jerusalem, one of his latest works, more mature works. That's a classic. In the 30s, he discovers Kierkegaard, and he's like, holy crap, how did I not know about this guy? And then in his book on Kierkegaard, he says Kierkegaard didn't go far enough. That's worth checking out as well. Ibn says, how do you start reading Plato? I got a whole video on that, self-directed study on Plato. You might check that out. Abadjar, why are most modern philosophers from Germany? They're not. I mean, I don't know where you would possibly get that idea from, but that's definitely not true. Kilibus, what does it say on your shirt? So here we go. Got my Wasp concert shirt. We're going to be seeing Wasp and Armored Saint later on this year here in Milwaukee. I've never seen either of them, but I've been listening to them, boy, since I was a teenager. I'm a metalhead from the growing up in the 70s and the 80s. So I'm really looking forward to seeing Wasp. Although, of course, it's not seeing the classic Wasp. It's Blackie Lawless and whoever he's got hired, and he's not playing bass anymore. He's playing guitar. Chris Holmes, Randy Piper, not with him at this time. They have their own things, by the way. Randy Piper has his own band, and so does Chris Holmes. Sire, what did Nietzsche exactly mean with the economy of the great style combining enthusiasm with power? I don't know. I mean, I'd have to like find the textual reference and take a look at it. So I don't know. Columbus, any thoughts about Saussure? Yeah, Ferdinand de Saussure is well worth reading. He sort of gets things started when it comes to semiology, which is, essentially French semiotics. He's very he's very important in structural linguistics. So, Jakobson and Helmslev and all those other people are building off of de Saussure. I would read his Cours de linguistique générale. I remember the translation of it that because we were reading it, a buddy of mine, and I remember I had the French version and he had the English version, and he'd like say stuff to me, and I'd be like, well, that's not what the French says at all. So I think you got to be careful about some of the translations of the Cours. One thing that de Saussure says early on in that work that I thought was really on point. You cannot be a linguist without studying and understanding multiple languages. It would be sort of like being a musicologist and only listening to heavy metal. You know that area, but you don't know anything else, right? So if you want to be good in a subject area and theorize about it, you really got to learn the stuff in that subject area, right? So if you want to like be a philosopher of history, you got to read a lot of history, right? If you want to be a philosopher of art, you better like spend some time probably doing some artistic production as well as appreciation, So, all right. Brian Collins, have you ever taught D.H. Lawrence? I have not, You say, I've been getting into him a bit, especially studies in classic American literature. He does come off as a weirdo. He is a weirdo. but so are most of the people we read. How controversial is he in lit philosophical circles? He's not controversial at all in philosophical circles because nobody reads him, very few people do. Literature, I don't know. I'm not a literature person. I would suspect that they consider him kind of old hat these days and that he's not all that controversial at all. British Floof, the best introductory philosopher is Heidegger. I guess if you're going to do that, you'd start off on, what is metaphysics, but Heidegger is definitely not introductory level stuff. Zeno, I have a hard time agreeing with all the great philosophers and have trouble forming my own opinion. Any advice? You don't have to agree with all the ancient philosophers or great philosophers. If you did, you would be logically incoherent and probably unable to function because they don't all believe the same thing, right? I would worry less about whether you agree or not and worry more about understanding their viewpoints. And if you take that off your shoulders, you'll probably, at least at this time, be a lot happier. And you don't have to form your own opinion. Who says that you have to have your own point of view? It's enough to like understand somebody else's point of view and say, yeah, this makes sense. Originality is really overrated, Kartoffelmanden, what do you think about people like Lukács who engages with Hegel from a Marxist perspective? More power to them, people can engage with Hegel from whatever perspective they want to. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be on point, that they're not going to like put on some blinders, but everybody's got blinders. It's not as if you ever approach Hegel from a pure Hegelian perspective, because we know that Hegelianism breaks up into different camps, which includes Marxism, right? So at least that's not quite as far away than like, say, engaging it from a Russellian perspective, rejecting the British idealist Hegelian philosophers of his own time, right? So I don't have a problem with it. Ariane, where would you move on to after introduction to philosophy like of Russell, Bertrand if you're a self-learner? Well, tell yourself half of what I've read in Russell's history is probably bullshit and off base. I would read primary texts. I always say go back and read primary texts. If you want somebody who's a contemporary of Russell, who's actually a decent historian of philosophy, actually more than a decent one, a good, careful one, Friedrich Cobblestone. He's got a whole history of philosophy you could read. And then you'll get, Russell's nagging voice out of your head, I guess. Chris, have you read Agamben? I have indeed. Colamus, what do you think of Roderick Chisholm's engagement with Anselm in his piece on free will? Haven't read it, but I'm willing to bet that Chisholm doesn't know much about Anselm, because it doesn't, that doesn't strike me as something that, when I think Anselm scholarship, I don't think about Chisholm, Abdullah Jabbar is getting a little contentious here. Why are most philosophers men? Don't tell me I'm wrong. Historically, most philosophers have been men. In the present, it sure as hell isn't the case. I mean, these sweeping assumptions, why have most writers been men? I mean, read Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, and she'll tell you all about this phenomenon. Or read Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women. Women kind of got screwed a lot of the time through most of history. We know this to be the case. Even big name philosophers, like, for example, Russell, or, A.G. Grayling has a history of philosophy that he's put out recently. Almost no engagement with the women philosophers who were there, like Margaret Cavendish or Mary Wollstonecraft. He mentions Hannah Arendt very briefly, Simone de Beauvoir very briefly, and a few others, but he totally ignores the rest, including Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia or Hildegard of Bingen, or all these other greats. But if you're talking about the late 20th century and the early 21st century, it's pretty, especially in like history of philosophy, it's pretty even. I mean, I could name you just in Aristotle and Stoicism scholarship, like hundreds of major female scholars who's not, I don't cite every single one of them, but I do cite quite a few. And I've been fortunate to meet some of them, like Julia Annis, rock star of philosophy, or I haven't met Martha Nussbaum, but she'd be in that case. Gisela Stryker, Nancy Sherman. I mean, there's lots of women philosophers. I've worked under how many chairs? About half of the chairs that I've worked under have been women. So, that's just not the case. Alex, do you think Hegel is the Protestant Aquinas? No, I think these so-and-so being this sort of thing, those are usually misleading. Hegel is doing a different kind of project, and his Protestantism, like, what was his, I'm blanking on his name. I can see his Hegel commentary in front of my face. Stanley Rosen. Stanley Rosen observed that if Hegel was an Orthodox Protestant, he was in a church of one, meaning that he was the only person who believed what he believed. Right. So no, he's definitely, if he's a Protestant, he's a really unusual Protestant, right? It's better to see Hegel as like doing his own humanistic thing over on the side. Nitros, what's your opinion on Islamic theology? Do you see any correlation between it and classical, modern, Western philosophy? I don't have opinions on Islamic theology because I'm not an expert in that. So are there correlations between it and classical, modern, Western philosophy? Depends on what you mean by classical. There's certainly like similar themes explored because sometimes they're working off of the same texts, and thinkers like Aristotle, right? So obviously there are going to be connections. Chris, what are your opinions on Agamben? I think he's probably the best living philosopher. Well, on that, we're definitely going to disagree. I mean, I think his work is interesting. I think he really has gone off the deep end when it came to COVID. So, Trololo, have you read Nassim Taleb? And if so, what's your opinion? I've read enough of his stuff to be like, yeah, overrated. And he really has a circle of fanboys around him, doesn't he? Especially on Twitter. I've seen him going after people and his fanboys going after people. I think he's way overrated. Colamus, Anne Conway is another woman philosopher. Yeah, there's like tons of them out there, Arian, I went to Cobbleston's review and it said to learn Russell. When I went to Russell, it said to learn Durant. I also saw people suggesting Anthony Kenny here and there. You're going the wrong places. Just read Cobbleston. I mean, why are you dicking around with reviews of stuff rather than actually just like diving in? you know. Durant, the story of philosophy. Okay, that's fun. You're getting more Durant than you are the people that you're checking out. Same thing with Russell. Same thing with Deleuze, by the way. At least with Deleuze, it's interesting, or Heidegger, right? Cobbleston is a much more careful scholar. That's all you got to do. James Ferry is late to the game about Deleuze and Guattari. Have you ever thought about doing something on capitalism and schizophrenia? If somebody wants to commission my time to take away from all the other things that I'm doing because they're so interested in me doing work on a particular person, more power to them. But they're going to have to, come up with the money for doing that. I've done stuff on Deleuze. I'll probably do more stuff on Deleuze. I consider Deleuze's work on his own much more interesting and rigorous than the stuff that he does with Guattari. But if people really want me to do that, okay. Abradon, Laura Hills attempted to argue that Locke derived most self-ownership idea from the Stoics. I mean, anybody can argue anything they want to. Who gives a shit? I don't know who Lisa Hill is. There's like literally tens of thousands of like secondary lit people out there doing stuff in the history of philosophy. I don't think Locke got it from the Stoics. I mean, that seems very implausible to me. I considered it quite odd as the Stoics talk about our bodies as being rented to us at best. Yeah, okay, yeah, maybe. And different views on suicide. Yeah, I mean, people will make any sort of argument they can to try to get their stuff published in some journal, but it doesn't mean that it's true, Alexander, if you could have dinner with any philosopher, past or present, who would it be and why? I don't know. I mean, there's a whole bunch of them who I'd probably enjoy having dinner with. I was just actually working on some stuff in Antisthenes, and in Diogenes Laertes, he's mentioned as like being this really great conversationalist. So that might be fun. Kant apparently was a great conversationalist at dinner parties too, and I probably would like hanging out with Descartes. He seems like a cool guy. Anselm introduced something, the Benedictines, it's supposed to be somebody reading and then everybody's eating and they shut the hell up and just listen to the reading. He introduced an innovation of having like discussions. So he probably would be kind of fun. I don't know. There's all sorts of people, I don't have any one philosopher who I'd be into. British Floof, have you read Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities? Yeah, I read that back in grad school. I had a girlfriend who was like super into Musil, and so she recommended it. I can't say that I remember an awful lot about it. Mark, glad to see you here too as well. I recently read Shakespeare's The Tempest, thought Prospero was an interesting representation of the distinction between the contemplative and political life. Any thoughts? Been way too long since I read it. So, and actually, I think I saw it about a decade ago, more than a decade ago, because it was at Fayetteville State University. So I don't really remember enough about it to have thoughts. Brian, how should Shakespeare be taught in high school where people are most likely to be introduced to him? Should teachers focus more on the tragedies, the comedies, a mix of the two? I don't know. I'm not a lit person. I'm not a Shakespeare scholar. I'd just be kind of happy that he gets in there at all, and I think we had Shakespeare in high school in some of our lit classes, but frankly, I was such a bad student that I don't remember what we did. I would bring in my own books and read them in class and kind of, I would take these honors classes because like when you had a grade point average, an A would count as a 5 instead of a 4, a B would count as a 4 instead of a 3. And I would shoot for like getting B's. And that way I could keep my mom off my back. I was not a good student at all. I had no intention of going to college. I was going to go in the army and then either like become a lifer or get out and become a mercenary because I had a friend whose uncle was a mercenary. And I just like partying and doing stuff, getting in fights, dating, stuff like that. So, good example. I was a bright kid and they put Shakespeare in front of me, but I didn't read Shakespeare because they told me to. So I don't know that's going to do that much. Abrudan has a funny remark here. Reading Taleb is like talking to that odd uncle at family reunions. Yeah. Abdel-Jabbar, short definition of postmodernism. There isn't one, and anybody who gives one to you is full of crap. So, I wouldn't worry about that. Averroes, what is the best part according to you in Aristotle's philosophy? There isn't a best part. I mean, why would there be? It depends on what you're looking for. He's got a book on metaphysics. There's a lot of metaphysics in the physics. He's got some great stuff on ethics that you put together with the rhetoric and the politics and poetics, and got a really cool, coherent whole there, along with Topics, Book 3. He's got logical works. Why would we have to have a best? Alexander, more non-philosophy question. Were you ever a fan of thrash metal? I was a fan of the OG thrash metal. I got into Metallica when they were good. And I count that as going all the way up to the Injustice for All, although that was terribly mixed, as Hetfield and Ulrich admit to. They treated Newsted poorly. They didn't make good use of him. So I loved early Metallica. I was super into Megadeth. I liked Anthrax. I never got into Slayer. I always thought there was something about him I didn't like. By contrast, though, I really enjoyed Metal Church. And there were other thrash bands as well. So I don't listen to like a lot of contemporary stuff, although we're going to hear a new band that I haven't heard before at Summerfest this year, and I don't remember their name offhand. Dan H, can we get any high school Dr. Sadler photos? People already have a long time ago. I mean, what do you think is in my Facebook profile and page? There's the ones that I have. I don't have an awful lot of photos, unfortunately. And, I've posted some stuff in Quora from time to time. You can see on my Sadler stories, there's like a shot of me in high school when I was getting muscular and stuff. So there's plenty of them out there. Mark, wildcard, what's the weirdest question you've been asked in one of these AMAs? I don't know. I'd have to go because I looked recently. I've been doing these since 2014. I should go back through some of these and see what some of the super oddball questions are, and maybe put them together in a video, along with the answers. White Crow, is veganism a moral responsibility? I personally believe yes. We talked about this at the top of the hour. No, it's not a moral responsibility. The moral responsibility is to reduce animal suffering and not to be a dick about it. And unfortunately, most vegans still today are kind of dicks. About that. JB Bell, I got into Metallica when they were still good. So, people don't know this, right? Cliff Burton was really important in early Metallica after they picked him up after Dave Mustaine was kicked out, because Dave Mustaine wrote some of the early material, and Cliff Burton was really, really central. And then he died. They replaced him with Jason Newsted. They did Garage Days Revisited, which was quite good, a bunch of covers. Then they did Injustice for All, which probably the thrashiest of their albums. We listened to that a lot when I was in the Army. And then I remember when the Black Album came out, I knew this kid who I'd tutored, and he was like, you got to hear this. It's the new Metallica. And he started playing it for me. And I was like, what the hell is this crap? I recognize the singer. I get what's going on, but this is kind of light crap, they've lost their way. And from that point on, I wasn't interested in where they were going, Ahmed, best argument on infinite universe? I don't have any. Christian, good Latin American philosophers, if any? I don't know. I'm not somebody who works on Latin American philosophy, so I wouldn't be. I could say a couple names, but I haven't actually read their stuff. Colomus suggests Borges. I guess we could consider Borges a philosopher, right? Imser, do you enjoy any video games? I used to, but I don't have the time for playing video games. Um, Constance, do you see any connection between the psychoanalysis of a Jung and a Freud and the ancient philosophers, the Greeks especially, in terms of what is human nature? No, and I wouldn't try to force any connection. I mean, obviously, Freud and Jung have read ancient philosophy, but people like to schematize these things, and I don't think that's useful. Shrey, do you think plants have life and by extension feel pain as well as a legit counter against veganism or vegetarians? Wow, I don't get into that sort of stuff at all. I mean, if you want to be a vegetarian or vegan, and you want to talk about, like, you could just already focus on animal suffering. How much does plant agriculture impose suffering on the worms and shrews and mice and all this other stuff? Plants don't have a lot of sensation, if they do have any. Dan, while reading the symposium, what would you recommend as a wine? Whatever you like. I'm not a wine person. you know. JB echoes, do a weirdest AMA video. Yeah, that would be good. Nate, thoughts on the films of Ingmar Bergman? I mean, I've watched some of them. I'm not a film person, like I said. Arian says, thanks for the suggestion. Can't wait to learn Western philosophies, some Indian philosophies, as I'm from Nepal. That's good. Yeah. And I'm sure there's people out there that are doing good work in Indian philosophy. All right, we're a little bit past the top of the time, and I've got to get some food in me before I have to do my philosophy chat for Patreon supporters in a bit. Imser, opinions on Jung? Not into Jung, definitely not into Jungians. I like reading Jung because he's a good writer and stylist, but I think stuff like the collective unconscious and archetypes, I just find that kind of stuff silly. Abdran is talking about some thoughts concerning education, which I read decades ago. He recommended Seneca and Cicero as essential reading. Yeah, okay. So appalled. So this is the last one I'll take, because then I got to go. Do you believe there's objective grounds for an ethical system? Depends on what you mean by objective grounds. Whenever we use these abstract terms, we got to be a little bit more concrete, specifying what we mean about that sort of stuff. Not necessarily in the sense of a natural law, but more of rational necessity. I don't know what rational necessity means. I mean, I think that we don't need objective grounds. We can just say this actually seems to make sense and let's apply it. And by the way, you notice that a lot of ethical systems, lots and lots of overlap, right? Remember that meme when it showed deontology, virtue ethics, utilitarianism? What do you do in the time of COVID? Mask up, stay home, get vaxxed, right? They'd all be recommending the same thing. Don't act like an asshole. I mean, there's an awful lot of overlap between ethical systems, and I don't know that we need objective grounds for them. I'd actually be kind of suspect of people who use that language a lot, because if they're waiting for that before they decide to be a decent person and engage in personal development and make hard decisions, that might be a problem. So that's a fitting place to end. Thanks for everybody for coming and asking your questions. And I'll think about doing that weirdest question video. That could be kind of a cool thing to do. Right now, I got to get my summer class up and running and then some other commitments met before I can do interesting projects like that. But all right, I'll see everybody. And I do want to mention tomorrow we got another live streaming thing. We've been talking about the Stoic virtues. We've got the virtue of temperance tomorrow, same time, same deal. Ask questions, get answers, and then the next Sunday after that, I'm going to have a free class on Light Hall, going over 5 more Stoic practices from Epictetus's Enchiridion. I actually put the link in the description to this video. So that should be fun as well. So I'll see all of you and catch you somewhere else.